In this video, I'll be making a ruined chapel out of XPS foam. This building was created as a terrain piece for my tabletop games, and I plan on running it as a hideout for a local gang of fanatics. Similar to my other builds, the idea starts off as a sketch and then turned into templates before jumping into the crafting process. The majority of the build is going to be constructed from XPS foam, and then will be cut down on my hot wire table. In order to save time, I do my best to make all my cuts in bulk. I'm going to be using a hot wire cutter to give every foam piece a deep wood texture, making sure to get every side since most pieces will be visible from both the exterior and interior. The construction of the chapel begins with the framing of the walls. I like to insert 3D printed bits whenever possible to help add detail and scale to my builds. These windows were glued to the foam frames and left to dry. This wall is being constructed to look ruined since I want one side of the chapel to look collapsed. I'm building this structure as real as possible since I want the chapel to look wooden from both the inside and outside. Usually I only have to worry about what the outside of a structure looks like, but since the inside is visible, I needed to tweak my technique for this build. Having real gaps between the wood planks was important to me and was achieved by placing the pieces on these frames. It's a pretty big time investment to frame each wall and cut out and texture every piece, but once I got into the flow of things, I found it pretty relaxing. I really like the end result as well. There's a bunch of texture both inside and out. Here I'm creating the back wall of the chapel. I end up remaking this panel to look more damaged later on in the build process. Next, I move on to the chapel steeple. I wanted this section to be integrated into the main part. This added a bit of difficulty in the construction process, but I made sure to figure out all the proportions beforehand in my templates. These horizontal planks are what add a lot of rigidity to the foam frames, similar to a real wooden construction. One side of the steeple will have damage to it to help add some texture to this side of the building. These damaged walls were a bunch of fun to make and I thought they looked really interesting, so I decided to remake the back wall of the chapel with a big hole. The framing of the chapel door was created by combining two 45-degree strips of foam and bending them into place when dried. This piece was then inserted into a gap on the front panel. Once dried, all the pieces were combined. I'm using wood glue for everything since I like the extra working time it offers. Next up is the floor of the chapel. I wanted there to be some contrast with the wood structure, so I decided that it'd be a tile floor. Each tile was cut out and textured, then attached to the main floor piece. After the floor was done, I created an altar with a few pieces of foam planks. At this stage, the walls were ready to be attached. A front wall was created, which would be the point of attachment for the steeple. Next, I moved on to the roof of the build. I started with crafting the rafters from my template. I then used this one piece to trace the dimensions onto the other foam strips. A ridge board was created and secured into place. From there, I attached the rafters one by one. I used a temporary piece of foam to hold the rafters in place until the glue dried. The smaller rafters that connect to the steeple were then glued on. Afterwards, I cleaned up the overshoot with a hot wire cutter. A bunch of foam strips were then created and textured for the rooftop. I added damage throughout this side of the building to help break up the flat surface area. I cut the foam rafters with scissors, then tore the edge by hand to make it look like the wood had been broken. This area was then covered in foam planks, making sure the rafters were still exposed. After the roof was completed, I sealed up the back of the chapel. The steeple still needed a roof, which I created by cutting and texturing a panel, then slicing the panels into planks. This section wasn't glued down yet since I wanted this area to be accessible during the painting process. Next, I created some pews out of foam and printed some 3D bits to help add to the storytelling of the terrain piece. I plan on running this ruined chapel as a hideout to a gang of fanatics. The hidden passage in the altar leads to a secret basement where the story continues. It's time for paint. I decided to airbrush on the first layer of black paint, since there's a bunch of areas in this build that would be hard to reach with a brush. After the black layer dried, I sprayed a coat of white ink from the top. This way, the ink only highlights the topmost areas of the build, leaving the shadows black. Once dried, I load up my airbrush with some burnt umber ink. This ink is transparent, so it's going to allow the value highlights underneath to show through. This was a quick way to give the entire structure a base coat that resembled wood. From there, I switched to my brush and made the wood pop a bit more by working up a gradient of browns, focusing the lighter highlights towards the edges of the planks. The floor was painted with a combination of grays. Next, I painted all the small interior details. I used an enamel wash to cover this cage and then sponged it off with mineral spirits. Certain parts of the build were given a dry brush of black pastel pigment to help define the shadows. Moss was created with a combination of PVA glue and flock. I placed this in select locations where moisture would tend to build up. Usually this is where I'd call it done, but my original vision had much more foliage throughout. I wanted this thing to look like nature has really taken over. So I took a trip to my local hobby store and picked up a bunch of new stuff to experiment with. This tearaway foliage ended up being the perfect product to create vines with for terrain pieces at this scale. It's always fun to experiment with new products, especially when you find one that really works. I placed these vines along with matching coarse flock throughout the build in select spots that I thought would look interesting. I'm using diluted glue with a wetting agent to glue the flock down. Then adding another coat on top to seal everything in place. And that wraps up this build. If you liked this video, make sure to hit the like button, leave a comment, and subscribe for future hobby content. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.